The last few milliseconds before dawn are a struggle between night and day, dark and light, frigidity and warmth. It is a time when the world hesitates, and dew that has leached from the atmosphere in the absence of daylight turns to crackling, brittle ice. For a brief black moment, our planet is in danger of ceasing to spin. Gary first became aware of this terrible hesitation early one Sunday morning whilst walking home from a party. He cursed himself as he weaved along the footpath, shoving his hands deep in the pockets of his old jacket. It was the middle of winter. He was freezing with the cold, and he'd lost his car keys. Probably a good thing, as he'd had so much to drink that he could hardly see, let alone drive. But Gary was not so drunk that he did not feel the moment when it came upon him, and then passed him by. The wet pavement beneath his stumbling feet seemed to shimmer, and then, "Christ!" he yelled as the thin soles of his cheap trainers slipped on the ice. Down he went, flat on his back, the air gushing out of his lungs as his balding head met with cold, unyielding concrete. Stunned and nauseous, he looked blearily up at the dark, frozen sky. For an instant, the river of stars scattered across it seemed to fade and wink out. Then he blinked, and it was over. An ephemeral wind sighed over the landscape, making him shiver. Light streaked across the eastern horizon, and dawn rushed happily forth. The earth would rotate, at least for another day. Gary stood up and went home, perfectly sober. "Hey, have you ever wondered what makes the earth spin around?" Gary asked some of his co-workers in the tea room at the supermarket where he worked. "Dunno what you're on about, mate," mumbled old Reg, looking embarrassed. A couple of young girls giggled at him. He guessed that they never thought of such important matters, merely working repetitively at checkouts, going mindlessly about their work like the automatons that would one day replace them. "Well, I think it's the very act of observation," Gary continued, his voice filled with evangelical enthusiasm. "If someone isn't there to witness it and be aware of the fact that they are witnessing it, the day would never dawn. Let me tell you about what happened to me yesterday." The tea room suddenly went silent. People looked uncomfortable. The girls gazed studiously down at their mobile phones. Red shuffled in his seat and shifted his coffee cup, refusing to meet Gary's eyes. This hurt. Previously, Gary had considered his co-workers were also his friends. Now he wasn't so sure. Did they think he was an idiot? Clearly! Gary pushed his chair back from the table hard. He stood up, and then he walked away. Thereafter, he resolved to be more careful of what he said to people and whom he spoke to about the dawn. Nobody else was capable of understanding what the hell he was on about, it seemed. At work, he would keep his head down, just do his job and speak to no one. Outside of hours, all invitations to go out with friends would be politely refused. His job was now to detect the dawn. He was a critical observer, not just a citizen scientist, someone far more important. Friends, co-workers, acquaintances, they were no more than actors in a play so grand that they couldn't even begin to comprehend it. Every morning he must observe the rising of the sun to ensure the world would go on. Then the millions of fools around him could continue to exist. The top of the bridge that connected the small island where Gary lived with the mainland was a good place to see dawn break. Its tall grey structure arced gracefully across choppy waters quite close to his home, so on the second morning he woke with an hour to spare and walked the short distance to it. Hurrying along the bridge's pedestrian path, which was deserted at that hour, he watched as a stream of traffic tore across the roadway. Early morning commuters were heading to work off-island, and he watched them, clutching his dawn secret to himself in excitement. Foolish workers, they had no idea. Choking steam belched from car and truck exhausts, whipped away by a biting sea breeze. The air was cold and getting colder. Gary knew the time when it was going to happen again was drawing near. Reaching the highest point on the bridge, he sat down on the pedestrian ramp and crossed his legs, facing east. With the traffic at his back, he stared out through the bridge safety railing at the twinkling lights of a small fishing village on the mainland, crouched at the mouth of the bay his island home bordered. Boats clung to the sides of the piers below the bridge, seeking shelter from the waves, while a long way below him, deep black water pounded relentlessly at massive concrete footings. Above him, an expectant night sky waited impatiently to be pushed aside. This time, he wasn't taken by surprise. He was ready for it. Clenching his teeth, Gary forced his eyes to remain open as stars froze and the waters of the bay paused in their heaving. Air crackled with tension. Ice formed with an audible snap, and then a new day exploded powerfully into the eastern sky. Wind whistled over his head, and above him, Venus, the morning star, twinkled merrily. Feeling immensely satisfied, Gary stood up and went home for an early breakfast. Being a detector of the dawn was nerve-wracking work. Gary soon found himself unable to sleep at nights, afraid that he might not hear his wake-up call and miss the moment of daybreak. He didn't like to think what that would mean and what would happen if he were not on the bridge. The consequences, they could be terrible. It became easier to observe the sunrise and then return home to bed for a few hours during the daytime. Easier for him, but not for his employers. "Why weren't you at work again yesterday?" asked his supervisor. "Have you got a doctor's certificate?" Gary merely shrugged and shook his head. How could he explain? When they finally came, the words, "You're fired," meant nothing to him. "I have a far more important job," he reminded himself. Living alone, with very little to spend his money on, he'd managed to save a few dollars. He knew he could survive for a while without having to earn a living. After that, night shift perhaps. Winter moved on, and the part of the earth that Gary lived on gradually tipped closer to the sun. Nights began to grow shorter, and he found himself rising earlier and earlier to catch the dawn. Summer drew closer, and yet, in spite of this, ice still formed at the moment of daybreak. Every morning he saw it crystallize on the metal and concrete structure of the bridge, clinging to it like a persistent, malevolent fungus. He knew that if he was not there to act as a detector of the dawn, the ice would stay, building and building, until finally, in the static darkness of an eternal night, the bridge would collapse. The bridge and the dawn became Gary's only friends. Mates stopped calling him. Neighbours began to avoid him. Their children ran away when they saw him exit his front gate. Then one morning, as he sat on the cold concrete waiting for the sun to rise, he thought he spied a shadow standing nearby. It was on the other side of the roadway where there was no pedestrian ramp, but still, he could have sworn it was the shadow of a person. Who's there?" he called out, feeling suddenly vulnerable. There was no answer, and when he looked away for a moment, the shadow was gone when he returned his eyes to the same spot. Nevertheless, he was sure that someone had been there, watching him watch. The sun rolled over the horizon and he ambled home, wondering. Gary thought about the mysterious shadow all day. Could it be that someone else knew about the need to detect the dawn? Or was it just a homeless person seeking human company? Or maybe a whore from the back streets of the village looking for business? He felt an excitement in the pit of his belly that he couldn't explain. Who was it? The next morning he arrived a little earlier than usual, half hoping that the shadowy figure would return. Clouds rolled across the sky and began to dump a fine mist of soaking rain on the bridge and the village below it. A sea mist hovered just above the surface of the water, threatening to rise and make the sky even darker than it already was. Gary hated clouds and their accompanying rain. They made it so much harder to see the first light of dawn. He could not take his eye off the horizon for a second, in case he missed it. After a few minutes of sitting huddled on the pedestrian ramp of the bridge, he was cold and miserable. Droplets of water ran off the beanie he was wearing, trickling into his eyes and down his neck. "What a thankless task you have," whispered a soft voice right next to his ear. Gary looked away from the horizon with a start. There was nobody there. "Jesus," he muttered to himself, standing up. "I've been called a lot of things, but never that," said the voice, full of irony. This time, Gary was able to see where it was coming from. The shadowy figure of the day before stepped out from behind the metal roadside barrier and walked towards him. "Are you following me?" Gary asked defensively, taking a step or two backwards. "You were here yesterday morning, weren't you?" As the figure drew closer, it revealed itself to be nothing more than a small, poorly dressed fellow of middling years, with a balding head and a round babyish face. An unsightly mole on his cheek reminded Gary of a black teardrop. He thought the little man repulsive and took yet another step backwards. "You people watch and watch the sky, and all for the sake of creating a single reality from an infinite number of potential realities," sighed the little man. "Oh, it's hardly worth the effort." I don't understand what you're talking about," Gary stuttered. "I know," was the reply. Suddenly, Gary remembered the dawn. He refocused his eyes on the east, just in time to catch the moment of daybreak. "You nearly made me miss it," he hissed, first light bleeding its way redly through the rain clouds. "God damn you!" "He already did," the little man laughed. Gary spat on the pavement in disgust and looked down at the dark grey waters of the bay. When he turned to leave the bridge, the shadowy little man was nowhere to be seen. Friend or foe? Friend or foe? The question plagued Gary for the rest of the day, depriving him of sleep. Homeless dude or not, the fellow seemed to know exactly what he did up there on the bridge every morning. He had said something about creating realities, hadn't he? Gary was at once frightened and fascinated. Somebody else knew, understood. But what did the man want? He was after something, of that there was no doubt. Was it simply companionship? He'd said, "You people," implying that Gary was not the only one who detected the dawn. This thought thrilled him. Where were they, these other detectors? Tossing and turning in his bed, he tried to put such thoughts from his mind. He needed sleep, or else he would not be fresh and alert when the time came for him to resume his vigil. Feeling tired and irritable, Gary slowly dragged his feet up the pedestrian ramp of the bridge the next morning. Thankfully, the clouds had blown away, and the clear night sky above him held the promise of a beautiful day to come. Detecting the dawn would not be so hard today. This time, the little man was already there, waiting for him. "What are you doing here?" asked Gary, as he took up his usual position on the bridge, facing east. "I'm curious about you," replied the man. "You come to stand on this bridge and watch the dawn, morning after morning, convinced that the world will stop if you don't." "But it will," whispered Gary, staring off into the dark, afraid to look at him. "I know it will." "No, it won't," scoffed the man. "There are others, many others. You aren't necessary." "Yes, I am," croaked Gary, feeling his throat constrict. "Nah, you're useless," laughed the man. "I'm amazed you can't see it. Well-meaning, perhaps, but utterly useless in your lack of understanding of what you're trying to do. What makes you think that you, a simple shop assistant, are needed to start the day? It's absolute madness." Gary couldn't stand it anymore. Now he had an answer to the question that had been bugging him the day before. Foe. This man was foe. Turning away from the east, he lashed out with a fist at his tormentor. "Leave me alone!" he panted, pounding at thin air. The little man was more nimble than he looked, and he seemed to dodge every blow that Gary tried to inflict. "Go away! I didn't ask you to interfere!" All at once, Gary found himself in a crushing grip, his arms pinned behind his back. "Look!" shouted the man in a voice that was way too big for his body. He forced Gary around to face the east once more. "You are too late!" Gary stared in shock as he realized that the sun had already ascended some distance into the sky. The day had, in fact, begun without him. "Oh, I missed it," he whimpered. "Oh no, I fucking missed it!" "And yet, there is the dawn," the man said. "As I told you, you're not needed." Gary looked down at the waters of the bay, which today were swirling and sparkling with light and life in the early morning sunlight. He shook his head. "You're right. I'm obsolete. I'm a useless human being." An immense sadness overwhelmed him, and tears streamed down his thin, unshaven face. The world would always carry on, regardless of what he did. All his vigilance had been for nothing. His job, his friends, all lost. And for what? For nothing. It was only a short climb up the safety railing on the side of the pedestrian ramp. Gary teetered on the edge, and then, before he could change his mind, he found that he had jumped. The waters of the bay rushed towards him, and he knew a brief, intense moment of fear before he hit them, and the air was knocked from his lungs, rendering him unconscious. He sunk beneath the waves, and his version of reality became endless. The world continued to spin, traffic continued to flow across the bridge, and Gary's body remained hidden, hooked on an old piece of fishing net beneath the water. Eventually it was washed free, and someone walking along the pedestrian ramp spotted it floating lazily on a slack tide. Night had already descended by the time a police launch had chugged across the bay to collect it. Jumpers were a rarity in the peaceful fishing village, but Gary was not the first. "They should close the damn bridge to pedestrians or put up a higher fence, even if it does spoil the tourist views," said a young police constable as he and his colleague hauled the body into the boat. He looked up at the sky and shivered as a meteor flashed across the starscape, feeling something odd, hearing something indefinable, something he'd noticed before, usually around sunrise after a night shift. As soon as they could, the police turned their craft around and sped back to base. In the town of Cowes, at the other end of the island, a small, unassuming man in raggedy clothes walked jauntily down the main street, well pleased with himself. "Oh, yes, dawn would break tomorrow, but thanks to him, the world would hesitate, and the sky would freeze for just that little bit longer." With the death of each soul who watched the moment of dawn take place, the pause at the start of each day would gradually extend until the time came when the last of them would die out and darkness would descend. Reality in this universe would exist no more. A child in a stroller began to cry as he walked past it, and the little man smiled, dimples appearing like giant pockmarks on each side of his plump cheeks, his dark mole rising closer to his eye as if it crawled up his face like a living thing. He looked up at the sky and set his mind to roam, to dream, to search, seeking out his next miserable victim, strengthening the hesitation, causing the earth to hold its breath a little longer, until eventually it would suffocate.